I hope you agree with me. Yes, that was a substantive, fascinating, thought-provoking beginning to the day. It's my honor now to introduce the next panel, which, as they say, does not need an introduction. Will offer some perspectives on American foreign policy in the Trump administration, and they have some late-breaking news from the United Nations of what the president has said this morning. The two speakers are Governor Jeb Bush and Governor Bill Richardson. It's humbling for a mere former senator to be in the presence of people who have so many elevated titles. Bill Richardson was not only a governor, but Secretary of Energy, ambassador to the United Nations. One thing that Governor Bush and Governor Richardson and I have in common, just to keep us humble, is that all three of us ran unsuccessfully for national office. And I want to tell two stories. One is that on the day after, when I ran for vice president, I'm not getting into the details of this, Jeb. So when I go to my office in the Senate, it's all over, Al Gore concedes. And the very first call I got, December of 2000, my secretary says, Bob Dole is on the phone. So, wow, I said, hello, Bob. He says, hey, Joe, how are you? I just called to congratulate you. I said, for what, Bob? Well, you've just gained admission into one of the most exclusive clubs in America. People have run for national office and lost. And Dole says, and I'm the president, because I've run more times and lost than anybody else. Anyway, they're both. I'll tell you another post-election day. I ran for president in 2004 and lost. And the day after, my secretary said, Governor Bush, Jeb Bush is on the phone. So I had met Governor Bush, didn't really know him very well. And first off, I thought it was one of my pals pulling my leg. And turned out to be the real Jeb. It was really a gracious moment in a political life on a bad morning for me. He said, I just called to tell you that I saw your concession speech last night, and I thought it was one of the most thoughtful and moving that I've ever seen. And I thanked him profusely, and he said, that's it. That's all I called for. Have a good day. Bill Richardson and I go way back. Just if I could end with a happier political story, we both worked for Governor Bill Clinton in his 92 presidential campaign. We were both out, and we were all out with him as the host in New Mexico, drafting the platform for the Democratic national ticket that year. And it's something that we ought to take out of the museum and show to the current Democrats, because it was actually a center-left as opposed to left-left platform. Anyway, we're really grateful to these two great public servants for being here. This discussion will be moderated by Nicolle Wallace. Some people would say it's the least of her strengths. Some people would say the greatest, that she happens to be the wife of Ambassador Mark Wallace, but she's here because I insisted she be here. She's just one of the most smart, reliable, thought-provoking people on television today. You can see her every afternoon on MSNBC at 4 p.m. So she gives you the first opportunity to hear what President Trump had to say prior to 4 p.m. in the day. Anyway, my high honor to introduce Governor Jeb Bush, Governor Bill Richardson, and Nicolle Wallace.
There you go. You guys want to sit together?
Oh, you get in the middle.
Oh, I get in the middle. Wow. Okay. Hi. How's everybody doing? So while you were being informed and enlightened by your last panel, President Trump is trying to do the same at the UN, and I'll read you the Iran headlines he just made. He said that, well, he said a lot of things, and you can see them all on the news. But on the topic at hand, he called the UN-backed Iran nuclear deal an embarrassment to the United States and hinted that his administration could soon declare Tehran out of compliance. I don't think you've heard the end of it. He also called it an embarrassment and one-sided. Let's start right there, Governor Richardson, with the state of the Iran deal right now.
Well, I think it's on life support. You know, when I was active on this issue, I felt that the agreement made sense. However, I thought that there should have been side agreements that dealt with Iran's basic problem, its support for terrorism. It's messing around in every single dispute contrary to U.S. interests. Its attacks on Israel, refusing Israel's right to exist. And lastly, holding American prisoners, 7 right now, 1 in particular, Robert Levinson, who I think has been suffering or something's happened to him. We don't know. This is very important that we stand up for our Americans detained. You know, it seems to me, I saw the president's remarks yesterday. You know, like Governor Bush's dad, I was ambassador here, and he said the right things. The tone was right. You know, UN reform, cooperation, multilateralism to a certain degree on Iran and North Korea. And then today, what you just read, Nicolle, and I understand he also said something else about North Korea.
Yeah.
Which was maybe even tougher.
Yeah, well, he's got a new name for Kim Jong-un. He's named him Rocket Man. And about North Korea.
Elton John's all upset about that.
Yeah, I think so. It's a real thing. I think so. He said, "We meet at a time of immense promise and great peril." He talked about America first. I will always put America first, just like you, the leaders of your countries, should put your countries first. But he did go on to say about North Korea, a place you know well and a regime you know well, that the scourge of our planet is a group of rogue regimes, and then singled out Kim Jong-un's regime. He said, "We will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea."
Well, it's not a prelude to diplomacy, I guess. But,
You think?
but I'll you know, on Iran, I just think still, and I may not be in tune with this crowd, that try to make this agreement work, expand it. The Iranians are in non-compliance on the missile issue. If you look at the UN Security Council resolutions, but you keep pushing, but certainly on the other issues relating to terrorism, they need to do a lot more, and they're not doing it.
Governor Bush, you've accused me of having Trump derangement syndrome, and I'm going to accuse you of something much nicer, of being right about something. You, as a candidate, you predicted that Donald Trump would be a chaos president, and there's been a lot of chaos around personnel, around domestic politics, but I can't believe I'm about to say this, but in his defense on North Korea and Iran, he's been, I mean, I don't know how much clearer you could be.
No, I think once in a while, the chaotic nature of the president's words are helpful. I think it kind of sets the table in the proper way. North Korea is a rogue nation. Iran is a rogue nation. It kills Americans. More people in Iraq, more American soldiers died in Iraq by Iranian influence there than any other IEDs and direct involvement by militia. Their support for Hezbollah has grown exponentially from somewhere around $150 million to $800 million in the last 2 years when we, started by sending them the plane with the money loaded up in cash. These are regimes that need to be called out, and President Trump is pretty good at it. I would mark him down as neutral as it relates to Rocket Man, but that directness is helpful. What's lacking, perhaps, is a consistent, coherent policy to back it up. And that's where I have some comfort in knowing that the generals who have life experiences that are grounded in reality and understand these issues pretty well seem to be leading the charge. And that does give me comfort. And I think Ambassador Haley has done a good job of being direct as it relates to American interests, but at some point, the president's going to have to go from kind of this ad hoc diplomacy or whatever the foreign policy is to something that's clear and coherent, because at the end of the day, too much chaos and being unreliable creates real dangers. Our friends no longer trust us, no longer believe that we're a certain ally for them, and our friends and our enemies, after a while, no longer fear us unless we have a clear policy and that we act on it.
Let me ask you, sort of in your capacity as a former UN ambassador and as someone who sees pretty clearly how America is seen around the world, just to pick up where Governor Bush left off about the optics. I mean, the president, before he got to the headlines I read you, began his speech today at the UN, the way he begins a lot of his political rallies, by talking about high unemployment, by talking about bringing jobs back. What is the world's, before we get into what this president will ultimately decide on the Iran deal, what is the world's perception of this new American president?
Well, there's a lot of apprehension, but at the first, in the same vein, this is his first test before a major audience, 193 countries. And as I said, Nicole, by the way, I think I should be very careful here. I think the only Democrats here are myself and Joe Lieberman, so I'll be bipartisan. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. They're little Twitters here.
Yeah.
But I just think that, the UN, we pay 25%. We're enormously important there. Every president, every ambassador talks about UN reform, reforming the bureaucracy, better management. That's not new. And I won't say nothing ever happens, but it doesn't get much better than the current management situation today. So I think the tone...
Is that just inertia or a lack of will? Or?
Both. It's a very political body, and, it's the Security Council members get allocated certain jobs, certain responsibilities. That's always continued. I think you need some major reforms, expanding the Security Council, not with new veto countries, but I think Germany, Japan, other countries deserve some kind of representation that they don't have. So I think the tone yesterday was good, praising the Secretary General of the UN, Guterres, who's good.
Well, it didn't go both ways. When he spoke today before Trump, he singled the president out for criticism on refugee policy. And I mean, I don't think that when the week wraps, it will have been a warm embrace. And I guess I just want to lay this foundation before we get into the Iran deal, because one of the arguments, certainly by the end of the presidency of your brother, who I work for, was this sort of fatigue of going it alone. And I wonder just where you think sort of the community of nations is right now on America before we get to the prospect of pulling out of the Iran deal.
Well, I just think, Nicole, that the United States, even though we talk about America first, we talk about, isolationism, unilateralism, the president's campaign message. We need the UN. We need international cooperation on the three major issues that affect us: terrorism, Iran, North Korea, and ISIS. We need international support. We need the Europeans to keep enforcing the sanctions with Iran. We need China and Russia to go beyond the sanctions they've passed on North Korea. They're gradually moving, but they're not enough. We need, and then there are the UN issues that I guess have not even come up. The issues of poverty, hunger, health. I mean, the President Bush was great on endemic diseases, AIDS. He did a lot, and he did it at the UN. I think you need that international support, and I think the nations of the UN, after all, it's really a third world body. It's the forum for the third world: Africa, Asia, Latin America, with the Security Council the most powerful. I think they'll excuse the America first, the political rhetoric, but as long as there's cooperation, as long as we don't stick to we're going to cut the UN by 30%, which the Congress does that, and they won't do it. They'll cut it a little bit. Some of those issues that involve peacekeeping, as long as we stay within a certain parameter of the UN being able to function, I think it'll be okay.
Governor, I want to. Governor Richardson said that he saw the Iran deal at this hour as being on life support. I wonder what your assessment is of where the Iran deal is. I know there's some technical. The President Trump's position is that they are in violation in spirit. I know other experts think there are some technical violations as well. I wonder how you might counsel him to approach this, if there's some third way. We've talked about his national security team. He has brought in some people that might have actually made an appearance if you'd want. I mean, people like General Mattis and H.R. McMaster.
Well, first of all, I think, can I make a comment about just the broader U.S. policy, foreign policy? Because America First, resonates for people that are a little older. It kind of has a deeply disturbing kind of approach, and so some people hear this and are rightfully concerned. I'm not sure the president is invoking a policy of 70 years ago of deep isolationism and anti-Semitism and other things like that in his approach, but these are code words that probably we need to get beyond. And whether the United Nations gets cut or whether, I don't consider it to be particularly relevant in the whole scheme of things. U.S. foreign policy, U.S. leadership is what matters. And reestablishing the alliances that have served us well is in our economic interests and in our foreign policy interests. The notion that somehow we've been paying the freight and everybody's got a free ride, whether it's the UN or NATO or these other questions, misses the success of U.S. foreign policy when we lead. And that consistency, I think, is important. When we pull back, voids are created, and voids are typically filled by, as the president is prone to say, bad dudes. So restoring the traditional foreign policy, I think the president is moving in that direction, and I think that's a good thing.
Can I press you on that, though?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, he didn't. That wasn't his impulse and his instinct. And
No,
I
it
know
didn't.
that world leaders study his impulses and instincts because he didn't come from politics. There was no record, as a governor, or there's no brother or father that were in public service where he could study sort of the influences. And his impulses, his instinct at NATO was to push aside the prime minister.
It was, but,
I mean, so
but
what
then
do you?
he got it right the second time. And
It was about the fifth time.
All right, fifth time. But the point is that, as I said, the foreign policy is moving in a direction that would be a more traditional foreign policy. We've always had left and right, but generally in the post-World War II era, there's been a broader consensus. And I think President Trump, with his foreign policy team intact, is moving in that direction. Now, I may be wrong, but his impulses contradict that from time to time, but I would tell all the people that are analyzing his tweets and looking at his Twitch, on TV, or all this stuff, all these, the Soviet intelligence guys that do all this stuff, and we probably have the same. I would follow more what we're doing rather than what he says. I think it would probably be better.
Nicolle, I partially agree with the governor, but there's some fundamental issues that I don't know that they can be turned back. And that's America's role in the world, internationally, commercially, trade agreements. How are you going to revive the Trans-Pacific Partnership that was in our interest? Now China's going to find ways to take advantage of that. How are you going to revive, well, hopefully the free trade agreement with Mexico, which was, President Bush, both presidents were very much for, and as a Democrat, I supported against a lot in my party. How can you keep that intact with Canada and not, mess it up so that Canada and Mexico pull away? So trade issues, I want to see the European Union, NATO, strong reaffirmation. I want to see the Germans and the United States working together. France, we sort of are. A lot of optics that we are, but I'm concerned about some of those fundamental alliances that the governor mentioned that are going to be hard to repair unless there's a very rapid change.
Well, look, on the trade issue, I totally agree with you. I think that's in our economic interests, and for a competitive America, we need to open up markets and not be pessimistic, which is the the protectionist model is a totally pessimistic one that's doomed to failure. But as it relates to NATO, look, here's a place where the rhetoric actually has been helpful. Granted, the fact that he didn't embrace NATO to begin with, but you're starting to see European countries increase their defense budgets. And the Secretary General of NATO has made that clear, that is a contribution that President Trump has made. From time to time, it's okay to shake up the complacency. The idea that Iran should be considered embraced amongst the community of nations because they have an agreement in place with the United States, I think is foolhardy. More than half of the executions in the world occur in that country. There's no freedom of expression in the country. There's a theocracy that is exporting radical Islamic terrorism throughout the region, and they've made great strides. And the fact that President Trump is bringing this up, now hopefully backing it up with a powerful policy, that's the next step, the more important one, I think it's a good thing.
So let's go down both paths. You have a very smart audience here, so let's get in the weeds, a place where I know you like to spend your time. Let's talk about both scenarios. Say we pull out of the deal. What happens?
With Iran? I think that it will harm our relationship with our European allies. I think they will go it alone.
Sort of like the Paris Accord, but with nuclear power?
Nuclear weapons? I just think if Iran is complying, and according to the IAEA and U.S. and other experts, they are, except that provision in the UN Security Council resolution on missile activity and water caps and other things is not perfect, but I think we should retain that. We can't afford to have a nuclear Iran and a nuclear North Korea. Both of them, by the way, are working together. So I think it's important that we dramatically increase our commitment to get Iran to be more responsive on issues like terrorism. It's going to be hard. Yemen, Syria, I mean, just this Assad issue, this Russia is connected to that. And again, the American prisoners, it's always at the bottom. These are Americans, these are journalists, there's a Chinese American in the 7. I don't know how he got there. But it's important that we stand up for them. And Iran, one of the things I said during the Obama administration, I think right here, Nicolle, you may have been the moderator. They asked me, are you for Obama's Iran deal? And I said, well, I would have tried to get a better deal. And these are the side agreements on the terrorism. Why didn't we mix them up?
Why didn't we? I mean, what's the answer to that?
I don't know. I mean, I wasn't in the administration. But it's still worth doing. But with substantial changes now is what we should strive for. Now, if we pull out, the cost is going to be, we're not going to get nothing. And the president is the art of the deal, the great negotiator. Some of these agreements he gets out of, the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, NATO, and then Iran, what are we getting in return?
So your position is to use the leverage that we might pull out to improve the deal?
Yeah, I would think so. I think Iran wants to keep that. They want American investment. I would be very dubious about investing there. But I think Iran wants that American investment, European investment, and I think the U.S. there leads the way. One thing that I do like about the president's foreign policy, it seems like our relationship with Israel is back on track. It's back on track. That's fundamental. That's fundamental, and that's important. Although, somebody asked me about Prime Minister Netanyahu, who I've always liked and dealt with, but there he goes and endorses an issue important to me that I don't like, and that's the wall with Mexico. Why is he endorsing the wall with Mexico? Because he wants to please Trump. I want President Netanyahu to know there is a Democratic Party in the United States that should not be ignored.
Well, half the Republicans in Congress don't even support the wall.
Does he want
so
Mexico to pay for it, Governor?
Maybe Israel will pay for it.
Yes, ma'am.
Governor Bush, let me put the same question to you that I put to Governor Richardson about what happens if, because I think it's possible that Trump is using the threat of pulling out of the deal as leverage. That would be a savvy negotiation, I guess. But what if we were to actually pull out? What are your feelings about that?
I think it's hard to tell. I think the best thing to do is probably use the leverage of the agreement and enforce it much more rigorously. These technical defaults in the agreement are serious. They're not, the idea that you call something technical when it's a violation of the agreement, there needs to be consequences. So I don't know what kind of leverage we would necessarily have if we get out of the agreement right now. President Obama left President Trump with a there's a Texas expression I can't repeat here. It relates to something in a punch bowl. I mean, he's left a really difficult circumstance because all of the benefits are front-loaded for Iran, and all the possible benefits for the rest of the world, the United States, are theoretically at the end, maybe. And so, getting out of that agreement,
ticket, really.
Getting out of this agreement, we lose some of our leverage. Whatever path he takes, and he'll have that option to formulate that policy pretty soon here in October. He's got to make a decision again. I think we need to broaden out the whole relationship with Iran to deal with its aggression in the region, to deal with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's involvement and repression inside of Iran and outside. And I think one of the ways to do that, the biggest lever we still have, is to broaden out the sanctions to include the entire Iranian Revolutionary Guard, not just targeted individuals. They control a sizable part of the modern economy of Iran. And if we want to create pressure for Iran to change, both in the region and inside, I think that's the best path forward, irrespective of whether the agreement is ended or not. Because those are the issues that we can deal with our European allies where there's broader support. Germany doesn't like the fact that Hezbollah is creating a destabilized region. The allies of Israel, including the United States, don't like it. Iraq doesn't like it. The Saudis, I'm sure that the Prince talked about this, the issues in Yemen. Yeah. In every case, Iran is the destabilizing influence in the United States. If we want to lead, we need to lead a coalition that understands that.
And I guess the big indictment at the time of the deal was that we gave up all that leverage when we gave up sanctions. I mean, can you... The
president, my brother first, and then President Obama, tightened sanctions in a way that was really meaningful. They were working. And the idea that we gave that up in return for something where there's huge benefits for Iran today and yesterday, and very little in return for us other than the possibility that they'll comply, which they've never done before on UN sanctions, I think was foolhardy.
And not to put you on the spot, but I'm going to put you on the spot. What was the justification for leaving all those, for losing our leverage by giving up the sanctions and doing a deal? And I remember Secretary of State John Kerry said over and over and over again, this is just, and it was his deal with Zarif, that they were just doing the nuclear issue. They left the prisoners that were being held. They left everything else out. What was the rationalization for that?
And I agree with those points, and I think I made them here, that we should have gotten more. However, President Clinton gets criticized for the first nuclear deal with North Korea, the agreed framework in the mid-90s. But for 9 years, North Korea did not build a nuclear weapon. Then they did start cheating after that. But President Bush also tried to negotiate with him. It was very difficult. My point here is that with Iran, we don't want a nuclear Iran. And based on the best science that is out there, they are complying with this agreement. Now, I think we can do better. And maybe it's a point of leverage that President Trump is using, is he's able to exercise. Even if he gets Iran to say that they're not going to threaten Israel, they recognize their right to exist, and there's some cooperation on water or some other issues. I don't know if there is that potential. It's worth pursuing. I just worry that giving it up What do we get in return?
Then you have no nuclear policy and you have no leverage,
Yeah,
is your concern.
that's my view.
And you have an environment one way or the other, because I don't believe that the North Koreans or Iranians are angels in this regard. I think their instinct. We talked about the president's impulse with the Iranians' impulse, and the North Koreans clearly is to violate any agreement at some point. You have the extra challenge of nuclear proliferation. I mean, one of the countries that doesn't get much attention now is Pakistan, which has been the source of a lot of the export of technology to both these other countries. And we now have a relationship with Pakistan that's been diminished significantly as well. So this is a complicated subject. I go to sleep at night comforted by the fact that we have grown-ups in positions of responsibility in our foreign policy team.
So we've sort of narrowed in on the deal. Let's broaden the lens out a little bit, because you make a good point. None of this is the fault of any American president, not Clinton, not Bush, not Obama, not Trump. I mean, these are American adversaries for a reason. These are rogue regimes in North Korea and Iran. So let me ask you just more broadly about the bright spots of not just Trump's foreign policy and the team of people around him, but do you feel like these regimes are now so plainly they've made their ambitions so clear that even in an incredibly polarized climate where climate change and just about refugee policy divides not just domestic publics but the world public, do you think these two regimes have the potential to sort of unite a world community around some aggressive measures?
Well, you would think with the North Koreans launching 2 missiles in the last 3 weeks over Japan, that would kind of get people's attention. The length of which the last missile launch apparently was could reach Guam. So I don't know what point do we all realize that these are adversaries, that they are to blame for the insecurity that they bring, and that we mobilize support. North Koreans cannot survive without China, and yet we've not been able to forge a consensus or pressure China to go beyond these incremental steps that they're taking. And meanwhile, back at the ranch, it appears to me that the North Koreans are accelerating their efforts to provoke some kind of response. I mean, this is a very dangerous time. Bill, you know a lot more about this than I do.
Well, you know, Governor Bush was joking that he wondered if my Pyongyang suite was still available.
That was a joke, just for the record.
No, I know. You know, it's interesting. I've been there 8 times, but people ask me, what is Kim Jong-un like? What is he going to do? You know what my answer is? I have no idea. I negotiated with his father, and, you know, we had some successful, on a bipartisan basis. The last one was with President Bush. We got remains of 8 of our soldiers back. I think right now it's important to focus on what we can do to resolve the problem. And, you know, just today, the options are expanding. Some are talking about, you know, getting into the ships that bring in some of the goods into North Korea. I saw another interim step that was discussed, shoot down a missile before it gets anywhere to Japan, whether it's not sent to the United States. You know, I worry about those military. I don't think a preemptive military strike is going to work. Why? We got 25,000 American troops. We got 30,000 in Japan, 25,000 in South Korea. We've got 25 million people in the vicinity of Seoul. The collateral damage is huge. All right, but then what do you do? And you have, I think, as the governor said, Kim Jong-un being very, very warlike, being provocative. But I don't think he's suicidal. I think he's unpredictable.
Are you sure?
I don't think so. I mean, we would vanquish him very rapidly, but there would be enormous damage. So I think he's reaching an end game. And I don't know if this is the case. Why do I say that? I heard himself say 4 days ago, We're looking for a nuclear equilibrium. What I think that means is I'm going to find a way where I am so armed with an arsenal that I am now ready to negotiate. And I am ready to just say to the world that it's the United States and North Korea. We're the big guys in the region. It's not China, not South Korea. And we need to come to an accord. He didn't say that, didn't come close to saying that. But I think that's what he's throwing out there. Now, you know, you might have had Dennis Rodman here to find out his true psyche. So, because nobody's talked to him, Nicole. He talked to one Chinese envoy. So, you know, what makes the guy tick?
In the case of Iran and North Korea, I think the wrong policy would be the end result, legitimacy for the regimes. And that's what he seeks. He seeks an agreement that brings legitimacy because that's how he survives. In the case of North Korea, the theocracy in Iran has a similar view that their legitimacy with a stamp of approval from the United States allows them to maintain their stranglehold over a people, as I understand it, that is dramatically different. The population is young, it believes in many cases in Western values, and on top of that you have this Islamist regime that is holding on, and legitimacy, we're culpable by granting them the good housekeeping seal of approval. And I think we need to avoid that as it relates to North Korea.
But I think, Governor, then deep down, I ask the question again, what do we do? And here's what I think, where I think a possible deal is. And Dennis Ross, I don't know if he's still here. He was very good at these in the Middle East. But, you know, in exchange for a dialogue with the North Koreans, in exchange with a short-term dialogue, North Korea must freeze any missile or nuclear activity for a short period of time. And then if that works, that initial discussion, you expand it into what I think North Korea wants, which is economic assistance. I mean, the place is falling apart. People are starving.
Starving to death.
You know, his agenda, if you look at his speeches, he wants to build up his nuclear arsenal. And then he knows his economy's in trouble. He wants to build up the economy. You know, it's got, China this is why it has enormous leverage with oil, with coal, with North Korean workers and energy, fish, all kinds of commercial goods, textiles. This is where I think in the end, he's going to want to have something. I'm speculating because nobody knows. But I think that's eventually where, and you know, Jeb, your brother and President Clinton and Obama thought maybe there was an agreement there. There wasn't. But this is a new guy. And we don't know anything about the new guy, except he's provocative and I think there's an end game that he wants.
Let me ask you both about another player in North Korea and Iran, and that's Russia. Do you think Russia is playing a constructive role in Iran?
No.
Do you think America is doing enough to make Russia play a more constructive role in Iran?
Our vacillation, our pulling back, there's talking about voids. There was a big void, and Russia took full advantage of it. A lack of a policy in Syria created, for the first time you think about it, was it the 73 war where or 67 war where the Soviets were kicked out of Egypt? It was the Russian Soviet influence in the Middle East. Basically, there was an incredible period where they were pushed away, both in Afghanistan and then, as I mentioned, as a economic state, Egypt turned to the United States and to Europe. So that void now has been filled by a much more aggressive Russia. They have a presence in Syria, a military presence, but they also have a significant diplomatic presence. And this is where America First doesn't look so good. Where if it's America First, meaning it's only our economic interests, it's got to be good for us in the immediate term, short term for our involvement, we see the price that we end up paying. And the strengthening of the alliance when it's the guy's named Suleiman, the guy from the Quds forces, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, he sanctioned, the first thing he does is fly to Moscow. There's total coordination of their efforts to destabilize the region. And in North Korea, I don't know the extent to which Russian influence is there.
They were just seen together, they were just at a meeting in Russia, and it was just a stunning image. We covered it. Keir Simmons was there for NBC, and he said it was just so startling to see the North Koreans walking around on the streets of Russia. That these are rogue regimes by every American analysis, right, left, center, whatever. But in Russia, the North Koreans were sort of walking around, you know.
Yeah, the Russians are a curse for President Trump, best I can tell.
Do you have any analysis on why we're not more aggressive with Putin and his role in Iran?
I'm going to watch at 4 o'clock today and get more information on that, Nicole.
Do you? I mean, if America first is the policy, and I believe that's both instinct and policy from the president, why give Russia so much room to work against American interests in Iran?
Well, I'm going to say something positive and then go into your answer. A positive thing is, you know, early on, and you were in the White House, you were director of communications, Nicole. You know how important message is. And you know, early on, that chaotic messaging out of the administration. Who's speaking for the administration? Secretary of Defense, UN ambassador.
The mooch.
Yeah, I mean, Spicer, you know, Spicer was like talking about the Middle East. I said, I can't believe this. This would never happen anywhere else. I've met General Kelly, and I'm impressed with at least the structure and order he seems to have brought to the national security team. Yeah, I was skeptical, but and it was recent. So I think that's a good sign. Now, to answer the Russia question, you know, I think a lot of it is going to have to wait, any kind of move on Russia, till after these investigations are over. I mean, I don't see any movement. But in the end, you know, the relationship with Russia is very valuable to the United States. I mean, on Syria, Jeb, you know, Governor Perry, he called me. I've been named Secretary of Energy. Boy, am I going to have fun dealing with, he said, with energy policy and renewable. I said, no, that's not the job. You got to deal with nuclear weapons in the labs and Russia. Oh, really? Yeah.
Come on.
No, he's a good politician. I've supported him. But my point is that nuclear weapons, Syria, energy, European Union, sanctions, shale, and the way Russia uses its energy policy to extract concessions from Eastern Europe, NATO. I mean, we've got to find a way, and North Korea, they help China. I mean, if China doesn't veto on North Korea, Russia would have, I bet you. With Iran, the same way. I mean, that coalition in Syria is very strong. So I think it's incumbent that we find a way to at least not be buddies, but have an understanding that where right now we're in conflict in so many areas.
But they don't really get I guess what I'm asking is, I think the president made clear today at the UN that America first is not just the domestic policy, but the foreign policy pillar for his presidency. And I wonder how sort of the leniency on a state like Russia, especially when it comes to sort of the havoc they wreak in Iran, is permitted under that framework.
Well, you know, we need, I don't even know if we've got our ambassador there. Is John Huntsman?
He's today, I think.
He's today being
is he?
voted upon, yeah.
Well, that helps. An assistant secretary of Europe would help.
Right.
You know, somebody, you got to get a team in there, and that's one of the concerns I have about the State Department.
Right.
You know, there's just nothing there yet.
Right.
I mean, you meet with 2 people, and that's it.
short-staffed.
We need that underbelly of expertise that is not there.
We're going to let the group weigh in, but let me just get some final thoughts on sort of the Iran deal, where we go from here.
I think the president's instincts, to use the term that you've brought up a couple of times, are correct, that we need to broaden out the conversation, broaden out the efforts beyond the technical aspects of the agreement to the broader context, because in isolation, this only legitimizes the regime. So my hope is whether the agreement is viewed, whether Iran is viewed as out of compliance or not, that we bring back the coalition that is deeply concerned about the instability that Iran brings to the region and to its own country, of course, and to the world. And that American leadership.
And you don't care if that's in the
I don't know how.
You just want the conversation.
I think it's
broadened.
probably better. It's better to do it with the agreement intact, because you have the framework gives you leverage to deal with Iran in a forceful way. But if it can be done the other way, I think they are out of agreement with certainly with UN resolutions. The problem with the United Nations resolutions is we kind of pick and choose, or the UN picks and choose which one they want to enforce and which ones they don't. They're clearly out of compliance with that, and they're out of compliance with the the Corker bill that's a matter of law, that the United States is expecting Iran to behave in a certain way or there'd be consequences. So the president has lots of leverage beyond the framework.
Your last thoughts on the Iran deal before we turn to Q&A.
Keep the agreement, emphasize the prisoners more than we have the Americans, the Levinson case. Thirdly, obviously, the terrorism issue, Israel. I think Israel, some phrase that says Israel has a right to exist, some kind of Israel component to a new agreement, but leave the agreement alone. Now, if they're not complying, and the IAEA and our experts are saying it, Ernest Moniz, the Secretary of Energy, negotiated this agreement. I totally trust him. He was my undersecretary. He's a nuclear scientist. He said it's a good agreement. It's the best we're going to get. We cannot afford to have a nuclear Iran, and if we give up on the agreement, it's going to happen.
Okay. You guys are up. Questions? How are we doing this? Do you guys want to hand me? I think some of you, if you didn't get to write a question and submit it, raise your hand and they'll come over. Oh, goodness, I'm going to need
Some detailed
my
questions
glasses. Good Lord.
there. Some guy's written a book.
All right. In the context of America First and growing international nationalism and populism, how do you convey to the American public the continued involvement in the Mideast and Iran particularly is in the United States' best interest and essential to national security? Who wants that?
Well, I think we see the repercussions of how, when we pull back, the instability that brings, and that is not in our economic interests or national security interests. History is replete of examples where, when the United States isn't engaged, bad outcomes occur. So voids are filled. It's just it's the laws of physics that apply in foreign policy.
Iran in the Middle East. How is the future of the Assad regime tied to Iran's expansion in the region?
Well, I think this is a major point that affects Russia and Iran. I think Assad is a loser, and he's losing support internally. He has to be. But he stays on because the Russians and the Iranians keep him alive.
Propping him up.
And I think it's important that we find ways, levers, that involve a transition in Syria where Assad goes, maybe doesn't go entirely, but a transition process. I think that is achievable. I think we're making progress in the fight against ISIS. I think the Turks are key here. They're not helpful now, but I think a little work in the region. I know the special envoys are not popular these days in the State Department, but you can't have the Secretary of State handle everything. I mean, you need people to do this. Who's doing it? Who's even thinking about it? That's my worry.
And you made a good point. We're not staffed up at the State Department.
Yeah.
It's not all on the president. You mentioned this. I'm going to give you this one. In his speech at the UN, President Trump will reportedly offer U.S. support for the people of Iran against their Islamist government. What is the state of the Iranian opposition today, and how can the U.S. support the the elements in Iran that are already opposed to the regime?
I'm not an expert on the dissident movement inside of Iran. I just know that there's deep discontent, and the United States, I think, can play a constructive role in supporting dissidents all around the world. I mean, one of my objections to the Trump, at least the rhetoric of the beginning of his administration, this could change as well, is a disregard for human rights. And Iran is a poster child for repression of its people. And the United States, I think, can play a constructive role of getting information into the country and doing all sorts of things that we've done effectively in Eastern Europe and Cuba and other places. So I would hope that this is a recognition that there's more that the United States can do.
This is totally off topic, but you were governor of Florida. How do you feel about Cuba policy under Obama and now under Trump?
I think, first of all, I'm really curious to find out this attack on embassy personnel. I cannot imagine, given Cuba's repression, that the Cuban government wasn't an actor in that, a player in it. And I think that justifies the United States closing down the embassy until Cuba begins the process of transformation. This is another example, in my mind at least, of unilaterally conceding positions and granting legitimacy to a regime that doesn't deserve it. The president hasn't taken that step, but this may be the means by which he goes.
And Governor, that's, I know, a tough issue for you, but I think that makes no sense. I mean, you know, we have this relationship with Cuba that's emerging. I think human rights are important. We've got some leverage now with, you know, the softening of relations. We end the relationship in terms of our embassies. We close the. I don't know the facts. I mean, we ought to get some science here to determine what happened to our diplomats. I don't know. Let's get the facts first. But you know, in Latin America, you're an expert on Latin America, and I know. Look, the Florida issue. This is
no,
tough
it's not.
for
It's
you.
not politics, Governor. This relates to, I think, an important point. When we grant legitimacy to countries, we should get something in return. And is Cuba freer because we've now opened up our purse strings? There's more tourists going. The Cuban government controls all of the tourist industry. The military, similar to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, controls large swaths of the Cuban economy. Yes, there's little flowers are blooming, but the basic change that one would expect hasn't happened because we unilaterally conceded things without getting anything in return in advance. So I want to have full diplomatic relations with Cuba, but in a country that's free. So, I mean, it's just a different approach.
Let me get to a few more of your questions. What can the U.S. do to reduce the threat from Iran's ballistic missile program?
I agree, although obviously
Police agreement, right?
Yeah, obviously they violated the UN. I think it's 2332. I used to know these resolutions by heart.
It's a good.
You know, you need enforcement. You need the Europeans, the IAEA. I mean, it's a huge agency. Great jobs, by the way. And any of you guys want a good job in an administration. You know, the IAEA. You know, stronger enforcement, oversight.
All right, here I've got one that has one for each of you. For Governor Bush, what effects do you think the JCPOA has had in terms of America's standing with its allies?
I don't think it's had. I think the broader issues you're talking about, European allies, the partners in the. I think our relationship with the European countries that are party to it are broader, deeper. There's much more on the agenda. I'm not sure that reaching this agreement has done much to enhance or deter, hurt our relationship, to be honest with you.
And Governor Richardson, do you believe the JCPOA has changed or positively affected Iran? I guess it freed up a lot of money, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I think another point of leverage, and this is what I like about UANI, is I would not invest in Iran until they behave better, until they have, you know, stop some of this money laundering and some of these financial irregularities. That's, I think, a source of leverage. And European countries, other countries look at the U.S. Who's investing from the U.S. there? And I mean, nobody is. My point is that I think this is a lever that we have that I would not give up, but I would keep this agreement. I just don't see the plus for us by discarding it or in October saying we're not going to.
Bill, would you think that the violation of the UN resolution would give us the opportunity to go to our European allies and say, enforce sanctions along with us?
I don't think so, Jeb. I think the Germans, I think the French, no, they'll say no. We're investing, it's working. They'll talk about democratic reforms. I mean, look, Rouhani, the perception is that the moderates won. He has trouble with the Revolutionary Guard, as you mentioned. They're too powerful. We don't want to harden the hardliners. That's where our objective with Iran should be, not give the Revolutionary Guard, the hardliners, more ammunition to discard the agreement, to move towards investment, move towards human rights, move towards democratic elections. I know that's far off, but.
This is similar to what I was asking you, but put much more eloquently than I did. We have heard that Russia has been encouraging Iran because it wants a warm water port that will result from this crescent. How do we work with Russia when it is backing Iran against U.S. interests?
Well, first, we have to, this is a curse for the Trump administration. There's got to be greater clarity about our overall relationship. And I think there are things that we could do with Russia together. Bill mentioned nuclear proliferation should be one because they're a great nuclear power and they could see the dangers of that. We're not near that. They're concerned about Islamic terrorism in their own country. There's a role there. Right. But until we get to the point where we've established a stronger relationship with our own allies in Europe, and that NATO is clearly established, and we're not tolerating the kind of threats that we're seeing both in the Middle East and in these big, huge exercises in the Baltics and other places, I don't see how we're going to have the kind of relationship that would be productive in dealing with Iran.
If you're worried about my reason for putting anyone in the pile, it's either because there were two of the same question, or we covered it already. I see people's eyes darting to my pile. All right, what is there in the JCPOA to stop Iran from getting a nuclear bomb in another 15 years?
I wish Secretary Ernie Moniz were here to answer that. But the fact that there's our own people are saying they've complied, and the IAEA has said they've complied, gives me some assurance that it's happening. I mean, look, on the missile activity, the violations. But, I always get down to what are you going to do? And I think we've got to enforce any kind of increased oversight. Maybe the Congress can.
So one of the tools, one of the negotiating points might be to make, the answer to the question is nothing in 15 years because the agreement ends prior to that.
Right.
And there's nothing that stops them from
10
doing
years,
it.
right?
So maybe,
so started in 15.
So maybe the question of negotiation is to extend it to permanency. If Iran is, if you take them at their word, which is that they want a peaceful nuclear program for energy, which is kind of unusual since they're a massive oil producer, but give them, let's assume they're correct, then there are ways that we can help them, the world can help them have that capability without endangering the United States
or other
countries.
Provision.
Part of President Trump's America First foreign policy is a desire for American allies to share more of the burden when it comes to challenges like North Korea and Iran. Is there buy-in from our European allies for a more confrontational posture, do you think?
Well, on NATO, I think there's been a positive response, maybe because of changes in elections. For whatever reason, there has been an increase in defense budgets, although still pretty meager. I don't think the Europeans view their role as significant as it relates to Korea. And Iran, I think you're probably right that they see the commercial interest potential trumping the security issues, which is a mistake.
The only thing I would say is with North Korea, you need a new approach, new actors, new players. It's always the six-party countries, obviously most affected. China, U.S., Russia, South Korea, Japan. I think I'd like to see the European Union. I'd like to see Angela Merkel play a role in mediation. Maybe the governor's right, they don't have any totally direct interest. I'd like to see, I think this new Secretary General, I like him, Gutierrez, give him a role like Kofi Annan used to, Kofi used to get into every issue. Where's Kofi? He's now in Iraq, he's now in Africa. That's the role of a Secretary General.
And in some ways, with the president putting trade into the mix, obviously trade policy that would affect Europe too. So in some ways, the president's doing some of what you were talking about by broadening the conversation.
Yeah. I think in North Korea, I'll give the president getting China more engaged, getting them to put some
them out.
more sanctions, although they're not doing as much as they should. Mm-hmm. For them to agree to coal enforcement, oil import, there's a cap. For them to agree on seafood, not veto seafood exports, textiles. Not a total oil embargo is what would work. Then the issue is China enforcing it? Because there's a lot of cross-border smuggling. We don't know that. Nobody knows, but everyone dumps on China. I think they moved a little bit. They need to move a little more.
Why is their intelligence so crummy in North Korea?
Whose?
Ours.
Because you know why? This is way back, and I keep praising George Bush, his father.
What about the son?
Two.
I'm joking.
Most of the time. Well, no, let's not overdo it. But
everybody loves my dad. I'd like them to show a little love for my bro.
Nicolle, I think what happened was for years, our intelligence agencies, very capable people, the cream of the crop, we lost emphasis on human intelligence. Right. We should have more spies, more James Bonds. Know more about the Muslim world.
If the UNs kill their family members, it's probably dangerous business.
We had so many Russia experts, we didn't have Middle East experts. We need Asian experts. In North Korea, it's not all overflights. God, we missed the fact that they have an ICBM capability.
On a mobile launcher, right?
Yeah. So, look, overall, our intelligence community has done well. There's 16 of them. They do the best they can. I wish the president would listen to them more. But, we've got to restructure that to deal with America's threats. And having human intelligence is really important. And I'm not sure. Well, in North Korea, I've been there 8 times. I've never met anyone that I thought was on our side.
What is the current threat by Iran's Shia militias in Iraq, and what can we do to stop them?
The threat is real in not just Iraq, but Yemen, and clearly in Syria. Iran is actively engaged in one of the most tragic occurrences in the last 30, 40 years, where hundreds of thousands of people have been killed by an incredibly brutal regime in a war that is just brutal beyond belief. And Iran has got a huge fingerprint on all that. The Iraqi issue is one that's deeply disturbing because there's a lot of our blood and treasure in that country. And when we pulled back, it's not, I wouldn't call Iraq a client state of Iran yet, but their influence is growing. And it's the Shia crescent is real. And which is why this agreement, finding a way to leverage this agreement to get back into the game to bring stability to the Middle East is a good thing. It's in our national interest to do it.
I'm trying to do a lightning round here to get as many of your questions asked as possible. Let's see. Iran's President Rouhani threatened yesterday that the U.S. will pay a high cost if it pulls out of the nuclear deal. If the U.S. does decide to withdraw from the deal as it currently stands, what costs will the U.S. incur, and what costs will Iran incur? And who in the international community is more likely to be held responsible, the U.S. or Iran, if the deal collapses?
You know, I think leaders and secretaries of state, defense, they make these very broad statements. Many times they're necessary. You know, like Matt has said, if North Korea fires a missile that threatens the U.S. or Guam or Alaska, there's going to be very severe consequences. We're going to, I think he used, we're going to annihilate them. In a case like this, I just think the Iranian president is, you know, just basically saying, look, if you get out of this deal, you'll pay a large cost. What's the large cost? Well, they're probably saying we're going to form a brotherhood with North Korea, which they already have, to build weapons very fast. You know, but this is diplomatic rhetoric. This is, you know, raising the stakes. Our president is probably the best at that of any president.
The brinksmanship, right? Or raising the.
But it does bring up a flaw in the agreement, which is, assume for a moment that they are in violation and we call them out for it. The leverage is that they'll start building, accelerating their program. And we have no leverage against them. This is the problem with it. It's a contingent benefit to us, and they've gotten all the benefits up front. It was a poorly negotiated deal. This is another place where the president, what did he call it? He's called a few deals, like the worst deals known to mankind. This one may rank as all the horrible deals
the worst and
known to mankind. This might have been number one.
embarrassment of a deal. That's what he called it. Okay, this is the last one. This is my favorite question because it flips the script. I'm going to ask it of both of you, but it's written to you. What evidence is there that Iran is complying with the agreement, and how can we be sure they will continue to comply?
I mean, the
inspectors?
IAEA, our people, our scientists,
are verifying are they verifying compliance?
Yeah. They're at the intelligence agencies, at DOE, they're at defense. Yeah.
Well, we don't have the ability to go to the military bases without getting approval in a 24-day waiting period. So if you assume that these are little angels on top of the theocracy is made up of just, you know, little d Democrat people that love freedom and liberty, yeah, they're in compliance. But if you assume that this is a closed society where they operate covertly, which I think has been proven beyond any reasonable doubt, it's an interesting question because we won't have the ability to prove that because there are restrictions to the anytime, you know, anywhere inspection regime that should have been what was negotiated.
Final thoughts?
What's that?
Any final thoughts?
Well, let me say that it's a pleasure to be with Governor Bush. I've always, you know, I came to Congress, the end of the Reagan administration, his father, we worked together on the free trade agreement with Mexico and Canada on a lot of issues. I think his family's a tribute to bipartisanship in this country, and also UANI. How do I say it? UANI?
UANI, you got it.
Okay, I think this is a very good group. I think it makes sense to keep the pressure on.
Anything with Joe Lieberman in it makes sense.
Joe Lieberman's a great man.
A national treasure.
He's a treasure, and you know, lucky to. And Joe and I think, Jeb, are the only Democrats here except that guy in the kitchen back there. Oh, come on, man.
The press is here.
I'll take it. I'll take it.
Can I say so? I got to say something nice about
Governor. Final word.
I want to thank Governor Richardson. You notice I didn't call him secretary or congressman. I called him his highest and most important title, Governor Richardson. For
governors are always governors, right?
His public service, because it's been extensive, and I really appreciate being here as well. And I appreciate the support that you all provide UANI. It's a great organization and very important.
Thank you both. Thank you, guys.
That was good.
Thanks.